today we're going to focus on all these learning targets that I've highlighted in green. So it looks like we're going to go through quite a bit of material. We're going to take a look at two more cell parts. We're going to be looking at the mitochondria and the chloroplast. We're going to talk about how they're related to photosynthesis and respiration. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the mitochondria and chloroplasts. How did these structures end up originating in cells? And since we're talking about chloroplasts and mitochondria, we also are going to talk about structures and features that make plant cells different from animal cells. In your notes, we finished up talking about cells producing proteins, and cells can produce lipids using the smoothie R. And then below that is where we're going to start discussing the chloroplasts and the mitochondria. Now, the reason why I have these grouped together is because they're involved in energy transfer. The chloroplast is going to look like a green structure in cells, and it looks like it has stacks of coins inside of it. In contrast, the mitochondria is going to be about the same size, but you can see it looks like it kind of has a maze inside of it. So that's going to be the mitochondria. Now, the chloroplast is only found in plant cells. It's not found in animal cells. And again, it looks like there's stacks of something, like stacks of coins inside of it. Now, each coin is called a thylakoid. So I tell students to remember, instead of thylakoids, call them thylacoins. And one of those little coins would be one thylakoid. So think about thylacoins inside the chloroplast, stacks of coins. The chloroplast performs a process of photosynthesis. You have probably studied this in the past. If you don't have the equation for photosynthesis memorized, you're going to need to have it memorized for this assessment. Let's think about what we must give to plants, otherwise they would die. Plants must have water. Plants have to be able to take in CO2, and they must have light. If they're lacking any of these three substances, then the plants won't be able to do photosynthesis. Now, the reason why plants are doing photosynthesis is to make this molecule right here, which is food. So they're using photosynthesis to synthesize, which means to make glucose, which is their food, because plants don't eat, so they have to make their own food, their glucose, right inside of their cells. Let's diagram this process of photosynthesis down here. Again, since we indicated that the chloroplast, and this would be the chloroplast, it has those stacks of coins inside of it. The chloroplasts are going to need water, CO2, so we can see those are the reactants that are going into the organelle, and then also light to be needed. And then we see that something's coming out, so those are going to be considered the products. And this process makes oxygen, which is a gas, and then glucose, which is a sugar. Now we're going to talk about why plants just can't get by with only doing photosynthesis. Plants also have to have mitochondria to be able to utilize glucose. Since plants have both mitochondria and chloroplasts, and students often forget that, let's take this diagram and let's say that this is inside of a plant cell. So let's go ahead and indicate kind of a square here and indicate this is a plant cell. A plant cell has both chloroplast and mitochondria. Now, the reason why photosynthesis isn't enough, why a plant cell must also have mitochondria that's going to do respiration, is this glucose. Yes, this is a form of energy. It's chemical energy, but it's in the wrong form. This is unusable chemical energy. As another example, if you think about it, gasoline is chemical energy. We can get energy out of it, but can you use gasoline to charge your cell phones? No, because that energy is in the wrong form. Well, glucose has energy in it, but cells don't run off of glucose. They run off of ATP. ATP is another form of chemical energy, but it's chemical energy in the right form that cells can utilize. So let's indicate ATP is usable chemical energy. That's why cells have to be able to do both, and they need both chloroplast and mitochondria. The chloroplast is going to use the light, water, and CO2 to make glucose. And there's energy stored in glucose, it's just in the wrong form. The mitochondria is needed to take the glucose, let's indicate, and oxygen, and use glucose and oxygen to generate ATP, and we also end up remaking water and CO2. That's why we will say sometimes that the process of photosynthesis and respiration, what one makes, so we see here, this is making oxygen and glucose, the other takes. What one makes, the other one takes. Just note that this ATP is not going into the chloroplast. The chloroplast needs energy, but it goes off of light energy, not ATP. So this ATP is going to stay in the cell, and let's just indicate ATP for the cell to use. I don't want you to think that ATP then goes into the chloroplast. Now that I moved this down, let's go ahead and I'm going to draw the rest of my cell membrane and my cell wall to complete my plant cell. And let's indicate the chloroplast is interdependent, so it's dependent on the mitochondria. The mitochondria is dependent on the chloroplast. They're interdependent with one another because what one makes, the other takes. Let's go ahead and indicate a little bit about the mitochondria. I've been saying that it does the process of respiration. What the mitochondria is going to do is going to take that glucose, which is stored chemical energy, and it's going to release it. And it's going to take that energy and transfer it to a usable form of energy, or a usable molecule, which is ATP. Another way to express what's happening in respiration is we say that energy is being released when we break the bonds between these atoms, which are the atoms that make up glucose. And we're going to release the energy and use it to make ATP. Now, ATP is made by taking a phosphate and adding it to this molecule, which is ADP. We take ADP and a phosphate, and we end up forming a bond between them, then that makes ATP. And if you remember, ATP is nucleic acid, and that T stands for triphosphate. ADP has two phosphates on it. So if we add a third one, now we have ATP. So let's indicate that we are making ATP when we take energy from glucose, and we use it to help form a bond between ADP and another phosphate group, and that's going to make ATP. Now, to summarize, and we're going to make this just very simple model, is I want you to understand that if we take a molecule like glucose and we break these bonds that are holding these atoms together, when we break those bonds, we are releasing energy. So bonds can break, and when that happens, energy is released, or it's going to become available now. Over here, we have bonds being formed. Right here, we're forming that bond. Bonds are being formed in that ATP molecule. So we're saying that energy now is going to be stored. And that's why we can use ATP for energy, because we have energy that's stored here in this third bond that we can utilize for reactions. Now, if you know the equation for photosynthesis, you'll automatically know the equation for respiration, because they're backwards of one another. If we glance back up at the equation for photosynthesis, if you remember, for the reactants, there are three. And you can see here for the products of respiration, there are three. We said plants needed water, and they needed CO2, and they needed light. Now, we're not going to put light here because this would mean that your mitochondria is producing light, and I don't think any of you guys are glowing. But there's a different form of energy, ATP. So plants are going to need water, CO2, and light to do photosynthesis. Well, the mitochondria is going to make water, CO2, and a form of energy, but it's ATP. Notice the products of photosynthesis are the reactants for respiration. So photosynthesis makes oxygen and glucose, and those are the reactants that the mitochondria needs. Emphasize again that glucose, which is made in photosynthesis, but it's unusable chemical energy. But the mitochondria in respiration allows us to take that energy, break up the bonds of glucose, release energy, and transfer that energy to a different form of chemical energy, which is ATP. ATP then is going to store that energy, and it's in a usable form. If you think about it, there's energy in coal, but you can't plug your cell phones into it to use that energy. So the power plant is going to release the energy from the coal and convert it to electrical energy, and then you have energy that's in the right form. That's why the mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell, because it takes unusable energy and transfers it into a usable form. In this case, is for the cell. Moving on to the next page. I've said this several times. In science, it seems like we name something 3 different ways, and that can be confusing to students. So we're going to talk about the different ways that you can symbolize this equation for photosynthesis and also the equation for respiration. If you remember, glucose, C6H12O6, it's an organic molecule because it has carbon and it has hydrogen in it. So glucose is considered an organic molecule. In photosynthesis, we know that CO2 and water and light can lead to glucose and oxygen, but sometimes we don't put glucose there, and sometimes it says organic molecules. And you have to know that they're talking about molecules like glucose. So this is just a different way that we can write photosynthesis. Remember that glucose contains CHO in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio because it's a carb. It's C6H12O6. So sometimes when we show the equation for photosynthesis, we don't write the word glucose, we write the chemical formula of it. But you still have to know that that is glucose, and so this is a formula showing photosynthesis. Remember that glucose is a form of chemical energy. So here's another way that we can diagram this process of photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, light energy is captured in that glucose molecule. So we're using light energy to make glucose. And then finally, if you remember, glucose is a sugar because it's a carb. Sometimes when we see the equation for photosynthesis, instead of writing glucose here, they'll put sugars. But again, we're still just symbolizing this is photosynthesis. For the last section of these notes, we're gonna go all the way down. We've already been through these structures before, and we're going to focus on some stuff that we're going to see in a lab today. We're going to be looking at animal cells versus plant cells. So we're going to look at some of the main differences between plant cells and animal cells, and in your learning targets it says you need to be able to discuss four differences between plant cells and animal cells. One main difference that we're going to see is plant cells have a cell wall. So plant cells have a cell wall. Now, a cell wall is going to be on the outside of the membrane, and ultimately it provides structure and support. You can walk on grass, but you're not going to break the cells in the grass because they have a cell wall. If I walked on you, you would probably see some damage, some bruising, because you're going to tear cells because you don't have a cell wall. The trade-off is that they are, I guess, more durable. Their cells are more durable, but without the cell wall, we can be more flexible and we can move around. We can move our arms and move our legs. You try to do that to a tree branch and it's going to snap. Okay? To identify the cell wall, what you need to do is find the cell membrane, and then right outside of it is going to be that cell wall. So it's usually shown as a line outside of the cell membrane, because it's even protecting the cell membrane. The cell membrane can rupture. The next thing that we're going to look at is in plant cells, we're going to see these really big vacuoles. And vacuoles are storage, and mostly they store water. Now, if you think about it, it might not rain for a month, and so a plant cell has to have a large vacuole to store water for a long period of time. Animal cells, we do have vacuoles, but they're usually shown as smaller structures that kind of look like vesicles, and they also can store water for our cells, but we usually don't have to store water for an extended period of time. So a plant cell vacuole is going to end up looking like this large central structure. That's not the nucleus, it's the vacuole. Plants have to store a lot of water. We've already talked a little bit about the chloroplast. So another difference between plant cells and animal cells is plant cells, they have a chloroplast so they can do photosynthesis because they can't eat. Animals do not have chloroplast. Instead, we consume or we eat our sugars, and then our mitochondria converts it into ATP. Now, one thing I want to add is that plant cells have both. They make their food. So let's indicate out comes the glucose. But they also have to have mitochondria. So I want to draw mitochondria in there so you know that plants have both. They have both chloroplast and mitochondria. So here's the chloroplast, and here's mitochondria. Whereas animal cells only have mitochondria. So let's indicate mitochondria. We will eat sugars and deliver them to your cells using the bloodstream. The last difference is just note the structure. Usually animal cells are shown to be more round, whereas a plant cell is shown to be more square. We're going to see these differences when we look at our cheek cells and Lodia plant cells in the microscope.